For Americans, the Harrington National Heritage Center was more than a museum. It stood in downtown Washington, D.C., not simply as a building of stone and glass, but as a physical record of the country's rise, contradictions, and ambition. Once a fortified government archive during the early Republic, it had been transformed into a public institution meant to preserve symbols of power, conquest, and legacy. School children were brought there to learn what the nation valued. Foreign dignitaries were escorted through its halls to witness curated proof of permanence. The building itself was designed to project certainty. Wide steps, towering columns, sealed windows, and an architectural language that spoke of control and endurance. Over decades, the Harrington Center became a quiet monument to American confidence. Its collections were considered untouchable, not because theft was impossible in theory, but because no one believed it could ever happen there. This was the kind of place people trusted without thinking, the kind of security that fades into the background because it has never failed. Inside its walls rested artifacts tied to pivotal moments in U.S. history. Ceremonial regalia, presidential heirlooms, diplomatic gifts, and rare objects acquired during America's expansion into global power. Among them was the Liberty Collection, a sealed exhibit containing ceremonial items dating back to the 19th century. Pieces never moved, rarely shown, and valued not just in dollars but in symbolism. To lose them would not simply be an institutional embarrassment. It would feel like a fracture in the national story itself. The Harrington Center's reputation was built on layers of assurance. Surveillance systems monitored every corridor. Motion sensors mapped human movement with algorithmic precision. Display cases were engineered to withstand brute force, vibration, and heat. Guards rotated in staggered patterns designed by behavioral analysts. An operations hub beneath the building ran continuously, cross-checking data feeds and anomaly reports. Every contractor, cleaner, and technician passed through background checks that went back decades. In internal security briefings, the phrase zero-access environment was used casually, as though it were a fact of nature rather than an aspiration. Insurance companies rated the facility as one of the lowest-risk cultural sites in the Western Hemisphere. The assumption was not merely that theft would be difficult, it was that attempting it would be irrational. And for years that assumption held. Until one Sunday morning in late October, when the city was quiet, the streets were thin with traffic, and the building's confidence became its greatest vulnerability. The breach began at 9:41 a.m., unnoticed, unchallenged, and unremarkable to anyone passing nearby. There were no alarms at first, no flashing lights, no dramatic confrontation. From the outside, it looked like routine maintenance. A hydraulic lift stood flush against the eastern facade, positioned near scaffolding that had been part of a facade restoration project for months. Construction barriers blocked clear sightlines from the street, and the lift's presence blended seamlessly into the environment. Two men wearing reflective vests and hard hats operated the controls with the kind of practiced ease that discouraged second looks. They did not rush. They did not hesitate. Every movement appeared rehearsed, restrained, deliberate. At the upper level, just below a row of narrow reinforced windows, the lift stopped. Within minutes, a third figure emerged from the platform, tools already in hand. What followed would later be reconstructed frame by frame from security footage, but in real time, it unfolded in near silence. A cutting torch, calibrated and precise, softened the metal framing of a window designed decades earlier under outdated threat assumptions. A compact saw finished the work. The opening was small but sufficient. One by one, they passed through. Inside, the Harrington Center was operating under reduced weekend staffing. The galleries were open, but crowd density was low, and the Liberty Collection Hall, situated deep within the building's interior, was quiet. The thieves did not wander. They did not explore. They moved with certainty, navigating corridors as though they had memorized them blindfolded. Within moments, they reached their destination. Two adjacent cases housing artifacts tied to early American statecraft. Ceremonial objects whose public display had been approved only after years of internal debate. The cases were fortified, layered with sensors calibrated to detect stress, sound, and temperature changes. The thieves ignored most of it. They went directly to the weakest point, a structural seam invisible to visitors, but obvious to anyone who had studied the schematics. Portable grinders roared briefly, their sound swallowed by the building's acoustics and delayed alarm thresholds. Glass failed in seconds. Hands moved quickly, selecting only specific items, bypassing others of equal monetary value, but less symbolic weight. By the time the first alert registered in the operations center, the work was nearly finished. 7 minutes after entry, the thieves were already retreating, retracing their path with the same discipline they'd shown coming in. When the building finally reacted, it reacted too late. The illusion that had protected the Harrington Center for generations was gone, replaced by a single, unsettling realization. The most secure place in the nation had been breached without resistance. By mid-morning, Washington had shifted from routine to unrest. Police barricades sealed off multiple blocks around the Harrington National Heritage Center, forcing commuters and tourists alike into confusion. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras trained on the museum's sealed entrances as federal agents streamed in through secured access points. Inside, staff members were gathered in controlled holding areas, instructed not to speak to the press, not to use personal devices, and not to speculate. Despite those orders, information leaked within minutes. By noon, every major American news network was broadcasting the same message with escalating urgency. Priceless national artifacts had been stolen from a federal museum in broad daylight. Commentators struggled to find language strong enough to convey what had happened. This was not a burglary in the conventional sense. It was a symbolic violation. The Liberty Collection had been considered politically sensitive, historically irreplaceable, and strategically protected. The notion that it had been accessed so quickly, so cleanly, and with no immediate arrests sent shockwaves far beyond the Capitol. Within hours, the Department of Homeland Security convened an emergency briefing. Congressional staffers demanded answers. Cultural institutions across the country quietly raised their threat levels. The theft became more than a criminal case. It became a referendum on institutional competence in an era that promised total surveillance and absolute control. Inside the Harrington Center, investigators moved with a mix of urgency and disbelief. Surveillance footage revealed no dramatic chase, no internal alarms screaming for attention, no panicked guards sprinting through hallways. Instead, the recordings showed something far more unsettling: calm, unhurried precision. The suspects moved as though they understood not just the layout of the building, but the psychology of those tasked with protecting it. They timed their actions to exploit delay thresholds built into the security system, buffers meant to prevent false positives, now turned into windows of opportunity. Every step appeared calculated to stay beneath response triggers. Forensic teams dusted the lift controls, examined tool marks on the window frame, and cataloged microscopic debris left behind by the grinders. What they found raised further concerns. The equipment used was not improvised. It was specialized, modified, and chosen for speed rather than brute force. The thieves had not been improvising. They had been executing a plan refined long before that Sunday morning. As federal agencies took control of the investigation, attention turned inward. Security audits were launched not only at the Harrington Center, but at comparable institutions nationwide. The uncomfortable question no one wanted to voice became impossible to ignore. How much inside knowledge had been involved? The thieves had bypassed layers of protection that were not publicly documented. They had navigated service corridors rarely used even by staff. They had targeted specific objects while ignoring others that would have fetched enormous sums on the black market. This was not the behavior of opportunists. It was the signature of professionals who understood value in terms deeper than resale price. Investigators began interviewing employees, contractors, and former staff, tracing access logs that stretched back months. The process was methodical, but the pressure was immense. Every hour that passed without arrests narrowed the window of recovery. Artifacts of this magnitude could not simply be sold intact. The longer they remained unrecovered, the more likely they were already being dismantled, gold separated, stones removed, history reduced to raw materials. Meanwhile, public reaction intensified. Editorials framed the theft as a humiliation, a failure of stewardship, and a warning sign of deeper systemic weaknesses. Political figures across party lines issued statements condemning the attack on what they called the nation's shared heritage. Protesters gathered outside the museum's perimeter, demanding accountability and resignations. Social media amplified speculation, with armchair analysts dissecting security footage and proposing theories ranging from foreign involvement to insider betrayal. None of it slowed the investigation, but all of it increased the stakes. Behind closed doors, officials understood what the public did not. The first 72 hours were critical. If the stolen items crossed state lines, jurisdictional complexity would multiply. If they reached an offshore intermediary, recovery would become exponentially harder. And if the thieves succeeded in breaking the artifacts apart, no amount of arrests would reverse the loss. What had begun as a 7-minute breach was rapidly becoming a race against irreversible erasure. The question was no longer how the Harrington Center had been penetrated, but whether the country would ever get back what had been taken. The escape unfolded with the same discipline as the entry, but it was here, away from the marble halls and calibrated sensors, that the plan first showed strain. The suspects abandoned the lift several blocks east of the museum, blending into a maze of service roads and underpasses that fed into the city's southern arteries. Traffic cameras later captured brief glimpses. 2 scooters weaving through delivery trucks, cutting across lanes, vanishing beneath an overpass near the Anacostia River. From there, the trail fragmented. Investigators believed the scooters were never meant to carry the thieves far, only long enough to fracture pursuit and confuse early response units. What happened next was inferred rather than seen. Cell tower data suggested the group split, each member moving independently toward prearranged handoff points. Within an hour, the scooters were found abandoned in different neighborhoods, stripped of identifiable markings and wiped down with industrial solvents. It was a familiar tactic, one seen in high-level theft rings before: reduce every object to a dead end. But the Harrington theft was unfolding under unprecedented scrutiny. Federal, state, and local agencies coordinated in real time, mapping possible routes, analyzing toll records, and monitoring transport hubs. Despite the speed of the response, the suspects stayed ahead, until they didn't. Late that evening, a patrol officer responding to an unrelated call in southeast Washington discovered something that immediately shifted the tone of the investigation. In a narrow alley behind a closed storefront, partially concealed beneath refuse, lay a damaged ceremonial artifact from the Liberty Collection. Its frame was bent, its surface scraped, a gemstone missing entirely. The object had not been placed carefully. It had been discarded. This single discovery contradicted the prevailing assumption that the thieves were operating flawlessly. It suggested haste, internal conflict, or an unanticipated complication during the escape. For investigators, it was both a breakthrough and a warning. The artifact's presence meant the thieves had not yet left the metropolitan area when it was dropped. It also raised the possibility that the group had been forced to abandon part of the hall to avoid capture. For the first time since the breach, the narrative shifted from inevitability to opportunity. The recovered artifact was rushed to a secure federal facility for analysis. Forensic specialists examined tool marks, residue, and damage patterns, extracting information invisible to the untrained eye. The breakage was inconsistent with careful handling. This wasn't collateral damage from transport, it was the result of panic. Someone had made a decision under pressure, and that decision left evidence behind. Investigators began reconstructing the escape not as a single coordinated movement, but as a series of cascading decisions made under tightening constraints. That realization reframed the entire case. The thieves were skilled, yes, but they were not immune to error. And errors create trails. Analysts revisited footage previously dismissed as irrelevant, this time looking for subtle deviations. A hesitation at an intersection, a sudden change in direction, a moment where discipline gave way to instinct. Financial crimes units began monitoring unusual transactions tied to precious metals and gemstone brokers across multiple states. Customs officials were alerted to watch for components rather than intact artifacts. The theft was no longer treated solely as a cultural crime. It had become an economic and logistical one. At the same time, investigators faced an uncomfortable truth. The level of preparation still pointed toward internal exposure. Someone had known which pieces mattered most. Someone had understood response timing down to the minute. Interviews with staff intensified, shifting from general questioning to focused interrogation. Backgrounds were re-examined, personal finances scrutinized, professional grievances reconsidered. The atmosphere inside the Harrington Center grew tense as employees realized the investigation was no longer abstract. It was personal. Trust eroded quietly, replaced by suspicion and self-preservation. Outside, the public remained unaware of how close the case had come to slipping away entirely. Officials kept the recovered artifacts secret, fearing the thieves might alter their plans if they knew a mistake had been discovered. But behind closed doors, momentum was building. The breach had exposed vulnerabilities, but it had also revealed something equally important. The people responsible were human. And human plans, no matter how refined, tend to fracture under pressure. The turning point came quietly, buried inside a routine audit that initially seemed irrelevant. While reviewing contractor access logs, investigators noticed a pattern that had gone unnoticed for years. A private systems maintenance firm based in Northern Virginia had been granted recurring after-hours access to non-public corridors within the Harrington Center. The arrangement had been approved long before the current administration, renewed automatically and rarely questioned. On paper, it appeared benign: network diagnostics, sensor calibration, software updates. In practice, it meant a rotating group of technicians had spent unsupervised time inside the building's most sensitive zones. When agents cross-referenced employee rosters from that firm with recent financial activity, anomalies surfaced almost immediately. One name stood out: Marcus Hale, a mid-level technician with no disciplinary record, modest income history, and a sudden surge of unexplained deposits spread across multiple accounts. The transactions were small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds, but frequent enough to raise suspicion when viewed in aggregate. Hale had left the firm 6 months earlier, citing burnout. He had not been flagged during initial interviews because he was no longer considered relevant. That assumption was now in question. As agents traced Hale's movements, the picture grew darker. Travel records placed him in Washington during the week leading up to the theft, despite claiming to have relocated to Arizona. Phone metadata linked him indirectly to prepaid devices activated shortly before the breach. None of it constituted proof, but together it formed a narrative that investigators could not ignore. Hale was brought in for questioning at a federal field office outside Alexandria. He arrived composed, cooperative, and outwardly unconcerned. But the confidence eroded as agents began presenting details only an insider would recognize: maintenance windows, sensor blind spots, response delays embedded in the system by design. Hale denied involvement, insisting he had simply done his job. Yet when confronted with evidence of financial irregularities, his answers faltered. What investigators suspected, but could not yet prove, was that Hale had not been part of the execution. He had been the architect of access, the person who translated institutional trust into operational vulnerability. While interrogations continued, the thieves' clock kept ticking. Financial intelligence units flagged a surge in activity among small-scale refiners in the Midwest, businesses that specialized in processing scrap metal and reconstituting precious materials. One facility outside St. Louis reported an anonymous client attempting to sell unusually pure gold in fragmented form, offering cash incentives to bypass standard documentation. The timing was impossible to ignore. Federal agents coordinated with local authorities to monitor the operation discreetly, avoiding any move that might spook intermediaries higher up the chain. This phase of the investigation was the most dangerous. If the thieves sensed pressure, they could accelerate destruction, eliminating any chance of recovery. Surveillance teams followed suspected couriers across state lines, documenting meetings in parking lots, brief exchanges at rest stops, and sudden changes in travel behavior. The case expanded geographically, stretching resources thin, but also closing the net. Back in Washington, political tolerance for failure evaporated. Senior officials demanded progress, not explanations. The Harrington Center's leadership faced internal revolt as staff questioned how access protocols had been allowed to persist unchecked. Resignations loomed. Careers hung in the balance. Yet the most critical decisions were being made far from press conferences and hearing rooms. Agents weighed whether to intervene early and risk losing evidence, or to wait and risk losing the artifacts forever. The recovered ceremonial piece sat in a secure vault, a silent reminder of what was already gone. Investigators believed the remaining items were still intact, but only barely. Every hour mattered. The theft had begun as a symbolic attack on national heritage. It was now spiraling into a multi-state confrontation between patience and urgency, secrecy and exposure. And as the pressure mounted, one truth became unavoidable. The final outcome would be decided not by how the thieves entered the Harrington Center, but by how quickly the authorities chose to act. The decision to move came just before dawn on the 5th day after the theft. Intelligence units had confirmed that at least 2 remaining artifacts from the Liberty Collection were scheduled to be broken down within 48 hours. Surveillance placed the materials at a temporary holding site, an abandoned industrial warehouse outside Springfield, Missouri, chosen for its isolation and proximity to multiple interstate routes. Federal authorities authorized a coordinated operation involving tactical teams, financial crimes specialists, and cultural preservation experts. The objective was not only arrests, but recovery. When the teams moved in, they did so without sirens or spectacle. The warehouse was breached quietly, methodically, room by room. Inside, they found evidence of heist, unpacked tools, incomplete documentation, and protective cases already opened. 2 suspects were apprehended without resistance. A third attempted to flee through a rear exit and was detained within minutes. Most critically, investigators located the remaining artifacts intact, wrapped and staged for transport. The operation succeeded, but it came with a sobering realization. The thieves had been less than a day away from irreversible destruction. Had the decision been delayed, history would have been reduced to inventory. Interrogations in the days that followed revealed a structure built on compartmentalization. No single participant knew the entire plan. Roles were isolated. Information flowed downward, never laterally. The internal collaborator, Marcus Hale, had provided access intelligence in exchange for deferred payment and anonymity, never intending to be present during the theft itself. He had underestimated both the scrutiny that would follow and the fragility of trust among criminals operating under pressure. Charges were filed swiftly, spanning conspiracy, interstate trafficking, and destruction of cultural property. The legal consequences were severe, but the symbolic damage lingered. Even with the artifacts recovered, the illusion of invulnerability was permanently gone. The Harrington Center reopened months later under tightened security, but visitors walked its halls differently now. More aware, more skeptical. What had once felt eternal now felt contingent. In the aftermath, institutions across the United States re-examined their assumptions. Access privileges were rewritten. Legacy contracts were terminated. The idea that sophistication alone could guarantee safety was quietly abandoned. The theft became a case study in modern vulnerability. Not because the perpetrators were extraordinary, but because the systems they exploited were complacent. Congressional hearings focused less on blame and more on reform, though careers were still lost behind closed doors. The recovered artifacts returned to controlled display, accompanied by new interpretive language that acknowledged the breach rather than burying it. History, after all, is not preserved by pretending risk does not exist. Public memory of the event evolved over time. Initial outrage faded, replaced by a quieter unease. The story was no longer about a 7-minute theft, but about what it revealed: that confidence can harden into blindness, and that symbols of permanence require constant vigilance. The Harrington breach did not end the theft of cultural property in America, nor did it usher in a flawless security era. What it did was strip away certainty. It reminded institutions and citizens alike that preservation is not passive. It is an ongoing act, one that demands humility as much as strength. And while the artifacts were saved, the nation learned something far harder to recover: the comfort of believing some places were beyond reach.